Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. We received a couple requests for Chaos Warriors, and instead of going with contrast paint, I'd like to go back to a classic kind of approach to painting. In the first half of the video, I'm going to paint the model to a fast tabletop standard. Then we'll take the model up a notch or two in the second half. So let's grab our brushes and get started. After assembling the model, I began with a black primer. Normally I use gray or white primer, but since this model has a lot of dark colors, and I won't be using contrast paints, black is a good choice. Next I used my airbrush to spray a dark gray on the model, mostly from the top and sides. I'm using gray number 2 from my custom grayscale, and you can learn how to mix your own in this video here. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Eshin gray is a close match. If you don't have an airbrush, you could dry brush this layer instead. With the airbrush layer applied, let's start painting some base coats. First I painted all the metal areas with Iron Hand steel. I'm not too worried if some paint gets on the leather belt or the cloak, since I'll be covering those areas with opaque paint later, but try to avoid getting any paint on the armor. Once the first layer dried, I painted a second for an even finish. Next I painted all the leather areas with Dryad bark. You may notice I skipped past shading the steel, and since this is for an army, I like to save time by shading a bunch of areas at once. I'm going to base coat a few other areas first before I apply a shade. Then I painted the fur part of the cloak with gray number 4 from my custom grayscale. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Dawnstone would be a close match. I painted the weapon handle with Steel Legion Drab. And then I painted the horns with Zandri dust. Next I painted the cloak with Khorne red, making sure to paint carefully around the fur. After the first layer dried, I painted a second for an even finish. Now to shade the whole model, and I'm going to use Basilicanum gray contrast paint. I like this color for shading. It's like a stronger version of Nuln Oil. When applying a shade or a contrast paint, sometimes I like to wipe away highlights, and it's really easy to do. Just paint one section at a time, then rinse the brush, wipe it on a paper towel, and use the clean brush to soak up and wipe away any paint from the raised edges. Keep an eye out for any excessive pooling as well, and use the brush to soak up any extra paint in the recesses. After the shade dried, I painted the remaining metal details with Runelord brass, making sure to leave a thin black outline. Then I shaded the brass areas with Darkoath flesh. At this stage you could base the model and call it finished. If I were painting a whole army, that's what I would do. Get everything to this stage first, then work on a few at a time and add the highlights later. Let's start with the armor. First I painted a highlight on all the edges with the dark gray from earlier. I'm treating this kind of like Space Marine armor, and a general rule for the first highlight is to take the thinnest line you can paint and double it. That way it's still narrow, but it will be wide enough to fit the next highlight layers above it. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, consider being a channel member. We have some perks including a Discord server and early access to videos. For the next highlight I painted a very narrow line of Fenrisian gray. This color is a really big step up in value, so it's even more important to keep the line as clean and as sharp as possible. If you make any mistakes, it's very easy to correct with some thinned black paint. I like to double check all my highlights and use some thinned black paint to refine the shape as needed. Washes and shades have a tendency to leave an uneven finish on large, smooth surfaces like this cape. To even it out, we'll use a glaze of the original base coat color, Khorne red. Thin the paint with about 2 parts water, and with barely any paint on the brush, start painting some layers on the raised areas. There should be barely any paint coming off the brush, and it should stay exactly where you put it. If it runs off the brush, it means your brush is overloaded. Keep adding more layers after each one dries, and you'll get a blended effect. Next I highlighted the edges of the cloak with Mephiston red. Just like with the armor highlight, make this line about twice the width of the thinnest line you can make. Finally, I highlighted the sharpest edges and corners of the cape with Wild Rider red. Moving on to the leather, I began with a glaze of Dryad bark. I painted over most of the leather, leaving the darkest shadows in the recesses. Next I highlighted the edges of the leather with an equal parts mix of Dryad bark and white. I highlighted the weapon wrap with Steel Legion Drab. Then I highlighted the edges with a mix of Steel Legion Drab and white. Next I highlighted the horns with Zandri dust. I like to paint a few tapered lines along the length of each horn. Sometimes those lines are sculpted on, and other times I'll paint them freehand. Then I added a sharp highlight of Bonewhite near the end. I highlighted the fur back up with gray number 4. Since I'm just working on one model here, I'm painting all the fur clumps individually. But if I had more than a few models, I would dry brush this step instead to save time. Then I made a mix of equal parts gray and Bonewhite, and I highlighted some of the fur. Add as much or as little as you want. I think it would be a good idea to vary the amount of highlights across the model, and among the other models in the unit, since fur is natural and every animal is different. Let's work on the steel now. First I want to darken the shadows a little bit more, and I thinned down some black paint with water and painted a glaze. I like to paint a kind of gradation on weapons, with one side in shadow and the other light. Use the glaze to reinforce the shadows and get them nice and dark. Next I glazed the highlighted portions of the axe with Iron Hand steel. I like to think of this glaze like polishing the weapon. I'm not painting it on any of the shadow areas, just the sections I want to reflect the most light. Then I highlighted the edges of the steel with Stormhost silver. Finally, I highlighted the brass areas with an equal parts mix of Stormhost silver and Runelord brass. Canoptic alloy is a pretty close match if you don't feel like mixing anything, but I prefer this mix because it's stronger in pigment and I can decide the exact shade I like each time. I gave the model an ash waste base, which you can learn how to make in this video here. Then I added a few patches of snow. Start by mixing a paste of snow flock and white glue, and then use a sculpting tool to apply it to the base. Then immediately sprinkle some dry snow flock on top of each patch. This will add a layer to the outside of each patch and make the snow look fresh. You can skip this step if you want, and the snow will look a little more melted and slushy. I'd like to give a big shout out to our channel members. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below. Thank you. I think this is my favorite way to paint an army. You can paint everything to a good standard rather quickly, like 80% of the way there, and then get some games in. Then you can add all the highlights later, just one or a few models at a time. What do you think? Have you ever painted an army more simply just to call it finished, with the intention of putting in more effort later? Or do you like to finish each model completely before moving on to the next? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, And until next time, happy painting.